Hello, everybody. My name's Derek Murphy. I am the director and writer and narrator of the documentary series Preserving Worlds, and I'm also a librarian in Boston, Massachusetts, who does this filmmaking stuff on the side. I like to make documentary films.
And my name is Mitchell Zemil. Hi. I'm Derek's co creator on Preserving Worlds. I'm a filmmaker, animator, and professor of animation living in Brooklyn, New York. For Preserving Worlds, I was responsible for the cinematography, editing, and some of the production logistics.
So, first off, I'd like to say, I really wish I could have been at this meeting live. Sadly, I was not able to due to some complex and unanticipated travel issues. I'm actually, as you hear my voice, I'm currently stuck on an airplane, but I hope to make it to future Dead Web Club events. I think this is a really cool project. And I really would like to thank V2 and Kendall and Thomas for having us on. It's pretty exciting, and I'm very honored to be one of the first speakers at this club. So, yeah, I thought I'd get started and introduce the series for those who may not have seen it before. So, Preserving Worlds, we started out with it in 2020. It was really a pandemic era project. It's a web series. It's streaming on a streaming service called Means TV, which is a worker-owned co-op streaming service with a far left bent to it. So, very excited to be working with them. It's an original series for them, and they provided the funding. So, Preserving Worlds is a series about the preservation of online virtual worlds and also offline games where player contributions are a major component. So, for example, things like Doom or ZZT, where there's a very robust player created like map making community where over time you have sort of like a art historical canon almost of works created just by non-developers, just players of the games. So we're very interested in that kind of bottom-up player culture that develops both with online and offline games. And so this series is very focused on that subject. Every episode takes a different game or virtual world and looks at it in depth by interviewing a prominent community member. So we're almost never actually interviewing the developer or creator of a game, but really more talking with people who have a really high stake in the community of the game who are generally just players, regular people not directly involved in the creation or governance of the virtual world, but rather coming to it as a community member. So I wanted to start really by showing you this clip. This is an introduction to the series. This is sort of like we created this as almost like the little 1 minute long track one of an album that just brings you into it, right? So I think this will sort of explain the concept of the series better than even I could right now. So let's watch that, and I'll be back in 2 minutes.
If you log on to a long dead online game, what will you see? Who will you meet? When the profits have long dried up and the novelty is left, what keeps a virtual world going? What sorts of people are still hanging around? What kind of culture have they created? What traditions? What relationships? In 100 years, will anyone remember any of it? Virtual worlds are delicate things and they can vanish with hardly a trace. You can archive the offline software, but a dead world can only tell you so much. It's just as important to document how people spent their time within it. Welcome to Preserving Worlds, a travelogue that takes us through some of the most interesting and impactful online games and communities of the past 40 years. Along the way, we'll meet people who are working against obsolescence to keep the communities they care about alive and accessible.
Right. So you see, we're very interested in the historical legacy of virtual worlds, and we tend to cover virtual worlds that have been around for quite a long time. We're interested in sort of how an online community, which, online communities are a fairly new thing in terms of human history. We're interested in what it looks like for an online community to age into the decades. So when a community has been around for that long, I mean, we're starting to see basically the first old online communities, the first ones that are over 20 or 30 years old. And we're interested in the dynamics that arise after that amount of time, where, a solid player base has been interacting in one virtual world or around one game for long enough that maybe they've developed their own culture, terminology, relationships that are highly complex and developed. So, how did we come to it? Well, myself as a librarian, and I've also worked as an archivist, I'm very interested in digital preservation, especially of born digital works. And that does include web enabled works or works that rely on an internet connection to really work. So, when we're looking at virtual worlds, there's sort of a real preservation challenge you see there because, well, if you think about, preserving, let's say, like a film reel, that's hard enough. You have to take care of it chemically, make sure it's going to last, make sure it's not getting moldy or decomposing in any way. But when you look at a born digital work, it can be even more challenging because you can't just put it in a room and let it sit for 50 years. Climate controlled room, just check on it now and then. No, you have to take active maintenance of it in order to make sure that the given files can be read by future devices without being accidentally modified in some way, or it's tricky. You got to keep the storage medium working, and sometimes with digital files that can be tricky. You can't just have it on a hard drive and hope that one hard drive is going to keep working. You need to take more care than that. And when we talk about an online game, that's an even bigger challenge. That's another layer of difficulty in preservation because let's say you have something like, World of Warcraft or some other MMORPG. Now, maybe you save the software and you keep it running, runnable. You can emulate it or maybe migrate the files, get it working in 50 years. Then, if you boot it up and you actually can launch World of Warcraft, it's not going to be online. You're not going to be able to see anybody in the world. And isn't that the core of the meaning of these things is the player interaction? So the question is, how are historians in the future going to be able to really get a sense of what these virtual worlds meant to people, what it was like to log into them, and what it means historically? So I think the answer to that, well, there are many answers, but one that we're focused on is documentation. We're interested in capturing now what it's like in those worlds and what people are doing in them, how they're using them, and keeping that documentation for posterity. So, maybe you can't run, say, Mist Online Uru Live in 2073, but maybe you can watch our episode on it and see someone who is deep in that community talking about his experiences with it, describing the game, describing what it was like to play it, telling interesting stories that illustrate interactions and culture and player-based governance. So that's kind of our thinking. It's sort of like we're making a series that is sort of educational about these dated virtual worlds that, not everybody might know about. Sort of taking that anthropological or ethnographic lens where we're learning about the culture of the players, and also sort of making a historical record of how those games exist and how they're played at the time that we're creating this series. So we came out with season 1 in 2021, and we recently finished season 2 earlier this year. So that came out around June, July of this year. Yeah, and I should say that a big inspiration for this series came out of a lot of research I was doing when I was in graduate school for library and information science. I studied at one point the work of Henry Lowood and the How They Got Game project, as well as the Preserving Virtual Worlds project. These are two academic projects that are being run by a number of different institutions in collaboration. Henry Lowood is sort of, I think, at a high level of running both of those, and he is a curator of the history of science and technology at Stanford. So his thinking on this subject was a big inspiration. Now, I think to sort of illustrate the emotional core of what I'm talking about, I'd like to show this clip of, it's from our RPG Maker episode where we talked with Stephen Gill Murphy, who is a sort of creator of a cult classic RPG Maker game called Space Funeral. We talked with him about the RPG Maker English-speaking community, and in this clip, he's going to talk about sort of a way that players have been preserving these very ephemeral, excuse me, these very ephemeral RPG Maker games just created by fans that even some of them that maybe just nobody knows about, people are still trying to keep them around. So this is Stephen talking about that.
A lot of the games I was just showing off come from the rare RPG request thread on rpgmaker.net. People make an effort to go through all the abandoned MediaFire links and so forth, try and find working copies of what's still out there, so games, assets, patches, whatever else. I think there's a single user called Segnin. It started off as a request topic where you'd ask something of this one particular member and they would try and just dig through their hard drive and see if they had it. And then it became this elaborate resource and documentation project where you'd have a full list of how to contribute and notes on hosting. There's little tech demos for if you wanted to get a particular feature in your own project, you could download this and then kind of steal the way they did something. There's full projects. There's old games from people who kind of became better known in indie games later. There's collaborative games like the Alex projects. And all of these are uploaded one by one individually after all the previous hosting services. So RapidShare, Mega Uploads, those are all kind of shut down one by one. So every time there's kind of this continuous push to put everything up in a new place in a way that it can kind of be kept active. So it is kind of perversely inspiring to see, especially considering that if you played some of these games with titles like Donald Fuck RPG, produced as a joke by someone called Daffy F in 2003, slowly being moved from hosting server to hosting server until it's like readily accessible on the most easily used file sharing program in 2022, like 19 years later, that these could still survive is an inspiring and encouraging act.
Now, I'd like to talk a little more about the goals of the series, about what we were interested in and what we were trying to investigate as we were interviewing people. So, as I said, we're documenting ephemeral digital culture while it's still around, because as I'm sure everybody here knows, things on the web do not last forever, right? This stuff is, we're not talking about a diary someone wrote in the 1800s that got passed down through the family and you can just open it up and read someone's thoughts. You know, we're talking about stuff that is a lot harder to keep around than that. We're looking at, hopefully, thinking about both the history of the internet and how it led up to today to maybe inform the future of the internet. So the internet has changed quite a lot over the years, and we're trying not to just be a exercise in pure simple nostalgia, sort of saying we just need to go back to those days. But there was a lot to treasure in the days of the old internet, before certain areas of commodification really took hold. Although, of course, as we know, there always was commodification in the internet. But yeah, sort of those old Wild West days, we're looking at the legacy of those and thinking, like, is there anything that can be taken from the good of that time and brought into the present and the future? We're interested in what it's like to spend time in these virtual worlds. Now, we know that all of these virtual worlds we've covered, they're all very different. They afford you different well, affordances of control. Maybe you have an avatar in a 2D space or in a 3D space, and your avatar can do different things. Maybe you can fly, maybe you can walk, maybe you can swim. Maybe it's text-based chat only. Maybe you have voice chat. And, how do those different affordances construct a social experience that leads to higher level community over time? So, yeah, how does the medium influence the message? And, what can we learn from that? So, trying to get that broad picture of different ways of interacting online over the years, particularly in virtual space, cyberspace, rather than just on the web, right? For one thing, it's a lot easier to film and make legible and interesting a 3D space in the medium of documentary, right? Than rather than just showing websites. Let's see. We're interested in what sorts of people are inhabiting these worlds these days. What does it take to be a long-term community member? Um, who's around a game that launched in 1995, say, and is hardly populated now? Like, who are the hangers-on, or who are the people that are still invested and interested? What are they like, and what is their community like, right? Um, and we're very interested in sort of providing a balance. Like we one challenge that we were facing here was trying to balance the educational aspect and the entertainment aspect. So how do you educate about the history of the internet? How do you balance the historical side of things, trying to make a historical record that can help researchers today and in the future, but also provide an entertaining TV show that can be entertaining to the general public? So we didn't want this to be inaccessible to anybody who's not already super familiar with the games in question or with internet culture in general. We wanted something that was um, accessible to really anybody with any background, with any level of knowledge of this subject matter. So, trying to really like onboard people into each game. We provided some narration at the beginning of every episode before our interview and tour, and yeah, just really give people a little bit of an onboarding into the vocabulary, like what the game is, how it plays, its historical significance, and just really bring people into it. So, next, I think we'd like to talk about how we made this thing and the considerations and challenges involved. So, I think I'm going to really hand it off to Mitchell for most of this, as he did a lot of the logistic work. But first off, I will talk a bit about our pre-interview preparation, our research. So, every episode is really a long-form interview at its core, and we like to pair those interviews with a tour. So we have our guest tour us around the virtual world, or for an offline game, sort of give us a tour through their favorite player contributions. So, for example, with Doom, we had Liz Ryerson, a really excellent games writer and game developer herself and musician, give us a sort of a tour through her favorite Doom maps and build up sort of like a art history of Doom maps. Like, here are trends, common trends. Here are important works that led to, that were inspirational in other works, etc. So, but that did take the form of Liz sort of walking us through different Doom maps in the game while talking with us. So for all of these, we connected on a call with someone and looked at the game with them and kind of traveled through the game with them. So first off, selecting the game. What makes a good game? Well, we wanted a game that we could get together inside of with someone, if possible. We wanted a visually interesting and charismatic game that would work on film. In season 1, we wanted to include a text-based game. For example, we wanted to talk about Gemstone, but we had a hard time figuring out how do we show a text-based game on film and make that interesting? Now, we did end up finding a way to do that in season 2 through the use of judicious animation and other sort of visual assets that we created and added on to sort of keep people's visual interest. But so that was a consideration as we were selecting games. We wanted to select games that had been around for a long time, for decades, that really show off sort of the history of the internet. We wanted to cover things not just from one era, but sort of have like a longitudinal look at here's an important online game from the 80s, here's one from the mid 90s, here's one from the 2000s, etc. And in our latest season we even covered Final Fantasy 14, which is still one of the most popular massively multiplayer online RPGs going right now. So we really kind of went from the early 80s all the way to now over the course of the series. And we wanted games where there was always a level of player creativity and player contribution. So we wanted virtual worlds where players could create their own spaces or significantly contribute to the look and feel and sense of place and sense of culture of the game. And we also, in terms of selecting people, we wanted people that were deeply of the community, but like I said, we didn't necessarily want developers most of the time. We wanted a bottom-up approach, sort of in keeping with Means TV's leftist approach as a streaming service. We wanted to really take that bottom-up, rather than talk with the creators, like how do the people approaching, the users of these virtual worlds and games, how do they influence these? So sort of separate from any consideration of capital. These people aren't here to make money. These people are contributing to these games out of sort of like both a community orientation and an artistic orientation in the case of Doom or ZZT, or RPG Maker. They can be sort of platforms for a sort of like folk art almost, right? These are regular people, not necessarily programmers, using easily approachable and often free or extremely cheap tools in order to express themselves in a way that in many cases ends up becoming pretty popular and can often be quite influential on more mainstream game development. So a lot of talking with people, maybe that reaching out to people that maybe I was already familiar with from their work. For example, as I mentioned, Liz Ryerson, I was familiar with her writing. Reaching out to people that Mitchell or I knew personally, that we knew were deeply invested in a particular community. It helps having already been embedded in certain quasi-academic or particularly like weirdo or like high level of discourse game communities. Certainly helped to make connections and meet people that we felt were going to be great subjects for episodes. And really sometimes just reaching out to people out of the blue with no prior connection. For example, in our Active Worlds episode in season 2, I was familiar with the work of Bruce Damer, a early sort of like tech evangelist for early virtual worlds back in the 90s. He formed a group called the Contact Consortium that was dedicated to basically shepherding virtual world technology into the mainstream. I was familiar with him from a book he wrote about virtual worlds from the 90s, and found that he was still active on social media and had a website with a contact form. And I just sort of reached out to him out of the blue and said, I'm very interested in your historical perspective on this subject. And he was willing to speak with us. Similarly, I reached out to an archivist at the Danish Royal Library, who is sort of the video game preservation guy there, to talk about Hundeparken, a Danish browser-based social game that he was familiar with the history of. And as an archivist, he actually was able to do some archival work on the game and collect a lot of assets and such that your average person would have a much harder time getting a hold of. So that was really cool. We talked with all kinds of people. I think they provided amazing insights and ideas and thoughts about the history of these games. So now I'm going to turn it over to Mitchell to talk some more about the logistics of actually putting these episodes together and talk further about some of the insights we've learned from doing this work. Thanks again for having me.
Hello again. All right. As Derek suggested, I'm back to first talk to you about the logistics of putting together a project along these lines. We believe that there's a chance that some of you are either in the midst of or might be interested in doing something similar, archiving some sort of web or virtual content. And so hopefully some of our lessons and, things that we picked up along the way, you can fold into your own work. So I would say when it comes to making a virtual world documentary or archival project, one of the first things that's really important to do is seriously consider what your project's specific goals are, um, beyond the actual archival or documentary process. I guess I'll give an example. So for us specifically, with preserving worlds, we knew that we were providing a sort of edutainment sort of product. Means TV is first and foremost a streaming service for, entertainment, and for, just a consumer user base to enjoy and consume. And so this was not an exclusively academic project. The way that it was described to us was sort of a 50-50 split between entertainment and education, or historical record. So having to keep that in mind, we also being informed by that sort of edutainment balance. One of the things that I knew I was setting out to do specifically with the footage that we were gathering inside of these games was I knew that I wanted to capture the spatial and emotional qualities of each of these environments, both for, the purpose of, documenting that information visually, but also considering that the spatial and emotional qualities of these games, the architecture, the geometry of these different games, is going to be one of the more visually distinctive qualities from one episode to the next. And beyond the games themselves, our episodes are also subject driven, as Derek, talked about. We're finding important or at least involved members of the user communities in these games. So again, these are project goals that were specific to us. They are by no means, the standard for what you need to do. But again, that's why it's important, if you were to make a project like this, to consider what your goals are, because they're going to inform the entire production process and how exactly that works for you. And it took us a few times, a few episodes, as we're working on this to settle in on our sweet spot of what works best. And for us, we settled on essentially a minimum of 2 different shooting sessions per episode, per video game or virtual environment. So we would first have an in-world interview, and then later on we would go back into the world to gather B-roll. And I'll try and walk through the process for us as it is generically laid out. Episodes may vary, from time to time. We didn't follow this religiously, but this is what seemed to work best for us. Our first shooting session would typically be the in-world interview, as I would call it. All of our interviews were done with our subjects, our interviewees, in world, which is to say, while playing the game, while on an audio call, as using Zoom usually or Google Hangouts, whatever works. We wanted things to feel candid. We wanted things to feel like, they were actually happening in this space rather than sitting down with somebody, in a parlor or an office space or something and just talking abstractly about the game. We wanted to feel like we were in there in the moment as we're talking to folks, and we found that, what better way to get that effect than to literally be in there with them as they're showing us around, sort of like a digital tour, if you think of MTV's Cribs, if that's not too dated of a reference. But they're showing us our crib. They're showing us their neighborhood, their community, the world in which, they have the familiarity and level of comfort. So we start with the in-world interview, and while we're filming for this interview, not only are we recording audio and capturing our interviewees' words in order to, build the episode later, but in this particular shoot, I guess you might call it a virtual film shoot, one of the most important things that we need to do is capture the subject's avatar, because naturally this is sort of our one chance to physically see whoever it is we're interviewing. We don't really cut to anybody's real life, persona or image. And that is, again, intentional to get you feeling like you're not just talking about a virtual space, but you are inhabiting one within the episode. And so this is really our main chance to get good coverage of the subject's avatar. So oftentimes while Derek's leading and conducting the interview mostly, I'm doing what I can to film the avatar of whoever we're speaking with, get different shots, get different kinds of coverage, close-ups, long shots, medium shots, trying to use what I've learned in film school and apply it as best as possible to these game environments, while, of course, keeping up with these avatars because they're often running around, showing us places. We want them to feel uninhibited, and so they're free to roam around the game, fly around, teleport here, teleport there, and just act completely organically and naturally, while I and Derek act as sort of the invisible crew, in most cases as much as possible, trying to fly around behind them and collect a bit of good footage, hopefully. Beyond that, being in world with our subjects, with our interviewees, our guests, there's often spontaneous moments that will happen, unplanned things where somebody will see something crazy happen, or, some crazy in-world event, or, just some sort of unexpected encounter. And in some cases, that will get discarded in the edit, but a lot of times, especially if it's a particularly charismatic moment and particularly entertaining, that's something that we definitely want to be able to capture. And so we have to be vigilant in the event that something like that's going to happen. For example, in our Mist episode, there's a moment where our interviewee humorously falls into a hole and is unable to escape without, exiting to sort of the main world. There's another moment where a traffic cone in the game just kind of glitches out and the physics is kind of broken and it falls through the ground. And those are both just humorous, humanizing events that, remind you that the interviewee is not some, incredible authoritative figure, but is just often cases a regular user, maybe with, outsized standing in the community, but nonetheless, all too human and, keeps in line with sort of the fun, lighthearted tone that we are a lot of times trying to engage with. So having fun random moments like that, we want to be vigilant while we are interviewing. I will say that in these in-world interviews, balancing all of these different things obviously isn't always perfectly successful. So in a lot of cases, our footage might look something like this example from when we were recording an episode on Second Life. And you can see that in a lot of cases, as much as we're trying to avoid it, we might, be playing the game as it's meant to be played, which is to say, you're adjusting your camera constantly, you're kind of moving around a lot, we're keeping up with our subjects who are, moving around and exploring things. We're zooming in, zooming out, trying to figure out, where we're going in some cases. And all of that shaky footage, for some folks, it might be important to keep footage like that because it shows, maybe a more natural or intended or expected way of playing the game. That might just be a normal part of gameplay, especially for something that's tactical, some sort of MMORPG environment where combat is focused on more heavily. You might be adjusting the camera and moving around like crazy and maneuvering around enemies and the like. But once again, going back to our goals and knowing that we wanted to have a sort of more polished look of, a piece of both education as well as entertainment that is maybe a little more easily consumed. Shaky footage like that can, well, to put it, simply, it can make people motion sick. And that's something that you don't realize when you're playing the game. But then you look at the footage detached from that context. If you're looking at somebody else, playing through a game and moving their camera around, there's a lot of camera shake, and it can be a little discomforting, at least for some folks. So, that footage isn't always what we're trying to use in the end. Once we have our in-world interview, we thank our guest, we try to let them know that we'll be in touch as the progress happens, but also knowing that that is just the beginning of what is generally a 9 to 10 month process from the point of finishing the interview to finishing a particular episode. There's, in fact, quite a few more steps we got to get through. The main one, or sort of overarching process, being the actual editing of the episode. In the episode, you could say the edit of the episode, was generally broken into a few discrete processes. First of which is the assembly cut. This is the most bare bones edit that you're going to see. Essentially, the purpose of the assembly is to simply compile the recordings from interviewees and the interviewers. So, my video recording, Derek's video recording, our audio recordings, as well as the audio recordings of any folks that we are interviewing. And so getting all of these audio and video files together and syncing them up, that is our assembly cut. That synchronization process is a little bit muddier for a virtual project. Any sort of communication over the internet, over Wi-Fi, is going to have tiny little bits of lag or delay. And so a lot of times you might sync up the claps on 3 different audio files, but you'll find that one person is always talking 10 seconds before Derek is. And so there's a little bit of fidgeting and fussing in order to make it actually sound like a logical, normal conversation. But that said, it's still a relatively bare bones, straightforward process, and the result is basically our raw footage all put together on a timeline. At that point, once I finished the assembly, I would send the edit to Derek, who would then complete the next step, which is the selects. For the selects, Derek is simply going through the entire interview for a 30-minute, 40-minute episode. We would typically interview somebody for about 2 hours, sometimes closer to an hour and a half. But Derek will go through that entire clip and pick out moments, select parts, as it were, that to him feel like they are particularly important and things that, we need to keep in the episode. From the selects, Derek will send the project back to me, and I will begin creating the rough cut of the episode, essentially trying to, condense everything into a more watchable length. We eventually arrive at a point where, start to finish, the interviewee's words are pretty much in line with what we believe the episode will be, start to finish. And so we can begin going from, we can transition from the radio cut, the rough stage, into a process of further polish and refinement, what we might call a clean cut. At this point, our changes are getting more nitty gritty. I'm doing what I can to cut out any parts where the interviewee is awkwardly pausing, trying to find their words, trying to make folks sound as good as possible. If somebody's stammering over their words or what they're trying to say, that's an opportunity to come in and cut out some of the ums and hms. This is also the stage at which it becomes abundantly clear to Derek and I where we are missing sort of footage. That brings us to our second shoot that we'll do, which is the B-roll shoot. Occasionally we'll do multiple B-roll shoots, but at a minimum we generally have at least one. The B-roll is an opportunity to get more polished footage of our environment, to capture new spaces and offer more visual variety to our collection of footage, and try to showcase any other content, any other community or users or what have you, any elements of the space that we hear about in the interview but maybe don't get a chance to properly see. So we're really expanding our coverage. A lot of times we're also revisiting any of the spaces that we go to with our subject to get more detail shots and, again, to get more carefully constructed shots. And this is also an opportunity. We're not bound by the timing of an hour and a half to 2 hour interview. We can film freely for as long as we want. And so this is an opportunity for us to try a lot of different things and see what visually lands the best, see what has, for us, the best value. This is a quick example that I'm showing here from Mist Online, Uru. When we went back in for B-roll, a lot of times this was a chance for me to get specific camera shots that, again, are a great way of showing off the geometry of these spaces and show off, what's nice architecturally, graphically, sort of the design of these spaces. And one of the ways that we try to do that in filmmaking is with camera motion, adding the dimension of a camera panning or pulling out, pulling back, can really showcase dimensional qualities in an environment. And for us, we're often not trying to be like an action film. We're trying to get, shots that are a little more if not grandiose, that might be too big of a word, but we're trying to, um, showcase these spaces in a way that's not so flashy, but in a way that is visually appealing. And so having a particularly slow camera motion is really nice. So when we're not, trying to follow our interviewees from place to place really quickly, um, as much as possible, as much as the game's settings will allow, I'm trying to turn down my walk speed or my movement speed as slow as it can get. And I'm also oftentimes moving in really weird ways that you wouldn't naturally if you're playing the game. In a lot of 3D games, for example, if you walk backwards but at a slight angle to a wall, if you're walking into a wall but not perfectly perpendicular, if that makes sense, you'll be able to very slowly slide across that wall. And the result on, the end of your camera is a really beautiful, majestic, slow moving camera shot. And so that became a commonality for me in all of these spaces. I'm trying as much as possible to do to just back into walls and move really slowly that way. And sometimes it takes a couple of trial and errors. The actual footage itself, the gameplay, looks very weird, but the end result is often very usable footage that suggests a higher production value, and so it becomes worth it. Once we've finished up with our B-roll, we implement it into our clean cut. We just add that visual on top of the audio that we're putting together. And at this stage, we're also beginning to add our background music, any additional graphics that we might need. As far as the music goes, we're mostly trying to use stuff that's from these actual games. Some of the games don't have background music of any kind, or if they do, it might be like a 60-second musical piece that loops indefinitely. And that might be okay for like a little online social space, but it doesn't really work as well for a 30-minute episode of hearing the same song 30 times over and over and over again. So we will try and scout the internet for, I guess, other internet music, oftentimes sort of more ambient vaporwave that we feel fits the tone of the episode. And, we'll license with the artists to get their permission, yada, yada. And that can be a whole thing. But we'll do that. We'll, put together the graphics presentation. At this point, we might have additional animations that are overlaid on top of the footage to add just a little bit of character. A lot of times we have this motif of a window being dragged in by a computer cursor, and it opens it up, and it's kind of like a little pop-up window that shows some additional information that's being talked about by our interviewee at that moment. We also have these wonderful animated avatars. I mean, you've seen Derek's and mine, as well as from other clips. And these avatars are designed as still image portraits by a friend of ours, BachelorSoft. I'll then take those and I'll animate the mouth smacking, mouth jaw moving animation. Just add a little more immersion, a little more character and production value. And ultimately, all of these little different graphics that we have, don't do much to change the character and content of our episodes, but in our minds, hopefully help tie everything together. If anything, having that same layout from one episode to the next helps our series specifically feel like a continuous project, especially because the games that we are exploring are all so visually distinct. To use sort of their different displays and layouts would be a disservice to specifically the point of trying to make our episodes feel like a contiguous project. That is, again, tying into our specific goals and, what we are specifically doing with this project as a piece of entertainment commodity. So for academic purposes, obviously, you don't need to go about animating your own specific layout and having all these extra, dazzly things. But if you are making, say, a web series show that is meant to be both informative and entertaining, it doesn't hurt to have this sort of visual continuity from one episode to the next that ties everything together. At that point, our episodes are basically done. And then we can notify our guests. We can let them know, hey, we finished up. Why don't you take a look? And for us specifically, it's important that our guests are able to see at least a working cut of the episode, if not the final version, just in order to confirm with them that we are not mincing their words in any way or twisting what they say in the edit. A lot of times we're cutting things together and you don't always know if you're unintentionally suggesting the facts differently than how they are. So we don't want to misrepresent our guests. We don't want to misrepresent what they are saying in their own words. And so we make sure that they sign off on how we've put their 2-hour interview into, a more self-contained 30-minute, 40-minute product. So a few takeaways in summary. If you're making your own virtual world documentary or archival project, it's important to prepare and to be practiced. I would say don't be afraid to go in to the world as many times as you need to get what you're looking for. If you are trying to showcase a specific phenomenon or a specific quality inside the virtual world, make sure you're doing that. Make sure you're representing it as close to a faithful reproduction in your footage as possible. And more broadly, just knowing your angle, knowing what's important for you to showcase is, a important and mandatory decision, in my opinion. I would say if you are trying to do everything, if you are trying to show the objective, 100% inclusive, holistic idea of what these games are like, what these spaces are like, you will most likely fail. And that is not to be pessimistic, but just pragmatic to the point that if you have an angle, you're able to focus on that and show very strongly what that angle might be. That's not necessarily, coming out of particular subjectivity or bias. It is merely, just a recognition of you only have so much time with people's attention, and it's important to be able to make a decision, to have the authority to say, this is what's important. This is what's important for you to know about these spaces. This is important for what's important for me to show about them, and to go from there. It's going to ultimately strengthen the results of your project. At the end, you might also want to be considering your attribution, how you want to handle the attribution process. For us, in our credits, we did as much as we could to try and highlight authors of any user-created worlds that we visit, and especially anything that's not coming from the original base game produced by the developers. That is more or less assumed, to be what it is. But when it comes to games like ZZT, when it comes to custom Doom wads, Doom maps, and any spaces of that sort, whenever possible, it was really valuable for us to try and record the different places we went to and the different authors of them, if only because we wanted people who are watching this show to be able to visit some of these spaces themselves, to be able to look at, oh, this was an interesting, this is an interesting looking space. I wonder who did it. I wonder if I can check it out myself. And so being able to attribute the names of these different user creations as well as their authors makes them much easier to be looked up in a simple Google search. And so, that becomes sort of a part of our mission statement with our episodes. With that, I just want to say thank you all for joining us. Once again, our apologies for not making it in person, but hopefully we will have a chance to convene with the Dead Web Club at another time in the future. If you do have questions, I would say feel free to find us online. Derek is at Derek L. Murphy on the website formerly known as Twitter. I am Mitchell Zemil on the same website. And so, I'm sorry that we couldn't make it for a Q&A, but if you do have questions, don't hesitate to find us on the internet. And thanks again. I hope you all have a wonderful time on the internet and in real life and all that good stuff. Okay, bye.